The rain that night was not normal. It felt as though the entire mountain was trying to bury a dark, terrible secret. In the quiet, isolated hill town of River Pine, the streets usually went completely dead after 11 p.m. The fog was so thick, you could barely see your own hand in front of your face. But that night, inside the old Blue Pine Café, a warm, amber light was still alive. 5 people were still inside. Outside, a violent storm was raging. Inside, a suffocating silence. And then, at exactly 11:17 p.m., the fate of the cafe changed. The power went out. For only 5 seconds. For 5 agonizing seconds, the entire cafe plunged into a deep, freezing darkness. But when the lights flickered back on, a man was collapsing onto the floor, gasping for his last breath. A vintage, razor-sharp knife was buried deep into his chest. Fresh, dark blood was slowly seeping into the cracks of the wooden floor. But the most terrifying, deeply unsettling part of this murder was this. Every single witness inside the cafe saw a completely different killer. The Blue Pine Café was one of the oldest, most mysterious spots in this small town. Surrounded by towering pine trees, its walls were built from dark, aged timber. Old, dim amber lights hung from the ceiling. In the background, a slow, melancholic jazz track played softly, masking the tension in the room. And massive glass windows stood tall, constantly battered by the heavy, relentless rain outside. To the occasional tourists, this place looked romantic, cozy. But the locals knew better. They knew this place was lonely. It carried a heavy, unspoken history. On this particular night, the cafe was almost completely empty. The kitchen staff had already left for the night, leaving only one young waiter behind. Only 5 people remained scattered across the tables. Strangers to one another, each lost in their own private world. And among these 5 individuals, in just a few moments, a murder was about to take place. A murder that would shatter the peace of this town forever. First, Richard Vance. A prominent local businessman. Around 45 years old. Expensive clothes. A gold watch on his wrist. But his face was a mask of pure anxiety. His coffee had gone completely cold, but he didn't care. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, looking toward the dark corners of the cafe. As if he was absolutely certain that someone, or something, was stalking him from the shadows. Every few seconds, he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. Second, Nora Kaplan. A sharp crime journalist from New York, staying in town for a brief vacation. She had piercing eyes that scanned every little detail in the room. Her voice was always calm, calculated, and serious. She sat at a corner table with her laptop open. Her fingers rested on the keyboard, but her eyes were locked onto Richard. She was silently noting every single micro-expression on his panicked face. Third, Caleb. The cafe's lone waiter, stuck working the late shift. A simple, hard-working 22-year-old kid. But tonight, a strange, paralyzing fear was floating in his eyes. His hands shook visibly whenever he picked up an empty cup. As if he had recognized someone inside the cafe. A recognition that terrified him to his core. He kept staring at the wall clock, praying for his shift to end. Fourth, the old man. Nobody knew his name. He was a drifter, often seen wandering the mountain roads alone. He wore a soaked, faded gray overcoat. His beard was long and snow-white. His eyes were bloodshot and heavy, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. He sat motionless, staring into space, drinking one black coffee after another. Since he walked in, he hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't uttered a single word to anyone. He just sat there, like a ghost waiting for something. Fifth, Aiden. A young engineering student from the local university. He sat near the large glass window, wearing oversized black headphones. A textbook was open in front of him, but he wasn't studying. His eyes weren't watching the storm outside. Instead, he was staring at the window's dark reflection, closely observing the people inside the cafe. He watched them like pieces on a chessboard, analyzing their every move. And then, at exactly 11:10 p.m., the heavy wooden front door swung open with a violent thud. A freezing gust of wind rushed into the cafe, making everyone shiver. And a man stepped inside, completely drenched, gasping for air. His name was Ethan Orton. Ethan's hair was wild, and his clothes were dripping wet, pooling water onto the rug. His legs trembled as he walked, and his hands shook so violently it looked like he had just seen a ghost. Without looking at anyone else, he marched straight toward Richard Vance's table. He slammed both hands onto the wood. "We need to talk. Right now." The moment Richard looked up and saw Ethan, his face drained of all color. He looked like a dead man walking. Richard whispered harshly, What are you doing here? I told you never to come back." "Because running is over, Richard." "Hiding is over," Ethan replied, his voice a dangerous mix of terror and rage. Nora quietly lowered her laptop screen, keeping her eyes glued to the confrontation. Underneath the table, she subtly turned on the voice recorder on her phone. Outside, the storm grew more violent. The wind screamed, hammering against the glass. Ethan didn't sit down. He stood there, pacing like a trapped animal. His eyes darted frantically around the cafe, from the corners, to the waiter, to the silent old man. As if he expected death to leap out at him from any second. He leaned down closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "She knows, Richard. She knows everything. And she is coming." Richard slammed his fist on the table, his fingernails digging into the dark wood. "Keep your voice down. Shut up. It doesn't matter anymore, Richard. Tonight is the final night." Suddenly, as if someone had yanked the power lines outside, the cafe's amber lights began to flicker. The warm glow dimmed, surged, and dimmed again. The old man, who had been sitting like a statue, lifted his head for the first time. His hollow, lifeless eyes locked straight onto Ethan's face. And at that exact moment, Aiden slowly pulled the headphones down to his neck. Because he suddenly realized where he had seen Ethan's face before. It was on an old, forgotten missing person billboard on the highway. Exactly 11:17 p.m. A blinding flash of lightning ripped through the sky outside, so loud that the window panes rattled. For one split second, the entire cafe was illuminated by a harsh, ghostly white light. In that flash, everyone's terrified faces were frozen in time. And the next second, complete, absolute darkness. Power failure. A total blackout. In the sudden pitch black, a chaotic panic erupted inside the small cafe. A muffled, suffocating gasp escaped someone's throat, most likely Caleb. Then, the sharp, shattering sound of a glass crashing onto the floor echoed through the room. Next came the heavy screech of a wooden chair dragging aggressively across the floorboards. Heavy footsteps rushed through the dark, moving frantically. And then, a heavy, terrifying silence fell over the room. The only sound left was the roaring rain outside. And the fast, terrified breathing of the people trapped inside. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to breathe. Exactly 5 seconds passed before the old backup generator behind the cafe roared to life with a heavy mechanical groan. One by one, the dim amber lights flickered back on, blinding everyone for a moment. But the sight waiting for them froze the blood in their veins. Ethan Orton was lying flat on his back on the wooden floor. Right in the center of his chest, a vintage brass-handled knife was buried deep. Fresh, thick blood was spreading across his white shirt, dripping onto the dark wood. Nora stumbled back from her chair, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. The empty serving tray in Caleb's hands crashed to the floor with a loud metallic clang. Aiden sat frozen at his window seat, his eyes wide with absolute horror. And the old man. He didn't even stand up. He just sat at his table, staring down at the lifeless body. He didn't blink. He just watched, as if he had known this execution was coming all along. Because of the storm and blocked mountain roads, it took the police nearly 20 minutes to arrive. The front door banged open, and Detective Marcus Vance stepped inside with his team. The heavy thud of Marcus's boots echoed through the silent cafe. He looked down at the body first. Then, his sharp, calculating eyes scanned the 5 people standing in the room. His criminal instinct immediately told him this was no ordinary murder. The air was thick with conspiracy. Marcus pulled out his notepad, clicked his pen, and spoke in a cold, demanding voice. The power was out for only 5 seconds. All of you were right here. Who saw it happen? Who saw the killer drive the knife into his chest? After a tense silence, all 5 people slowly raised their hands. They had all seen it. Marcus thought this would be an easy case. But this was where Detective Marcus's worst nightmare began. Nora's statement. Marcus stepped up to Nora first. She took a deep breath and spoke clearly. Detective, as soon as the lights went out, my eyes were adjusting to the dark. I saw a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a heavy black overcoat. He plunged the knife into Ethan and ran toward the back exit. Did you see his face, Nora? Marcus asked. No, it was too dark. I couldn't see a face, but I am 100% sure it was a tall man in a black coat. Caleb's statement. Marcus turned his attention to the waiter, Caleb, who was visibly shaking. No, sir. She is lying, or she saw it wrong. There was no man over there. It was a girl. Marcus narrowed his eyes. A girl? What do you mean? Yes, sir. When the lightning flashed through the window, I saw it clearly. The killer had very long hair, like a woman. She was slender. I saw her long hair fly through the air as she struck him with the knife. Aiden's statement. Aiden adjusted his glasses, his voice trembling slightly. Sir, both of them are completely wrong. I was right by the window, and my eyes were fixed on that exact table. What did you see, Aiden? Sir, during the blackout, absolutely no one approached that table. There was no third person. Which means either the killer never entered the cafe, or we are dealing with a ghost. The old man's statement. Marcus walked over to the old man, who was still staring into his empty coffee cup. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Sir, what did you see? Tell me the truth. The old man slowly lifted his head. His voice was hollow, heavy, and cracked with age. He looked directly into Marcus's eyes and said, No one killed him, detective. He did it to himself. He executed himself for his sins. A chilling, heavy silence blanketed the room. A suicide? But the angle of the knife suggested something far more sinister. Richard's statement. Finally, Marcus approached the businessman, Richard Vance. Richard was completely drenched in sweat, despite the freezing temperature inside the cafe. He was nervously wringing his hands. Detective. I didn't see anything. The moment the lights went out, I felt dizzy and rushed to the restroom. I was inside the bathroom when the murder happened. Marcus stared deep into Richard's eyes. Richard's pupils were dilated, and his breathing was erratic. Marcus knew right then and there, this man was lying through his teeth. He was hiding something massive. The forensic team was just about to place the body into a black body bag, when Marcus noticed something metallic glinting inside Ethan's tightly clenched fist. Snapping on a pair of latex gloves, he carefully pried open Ethan's cold, stiffening fingers one by one. Resting in Ethan's palm was an old, elegant lady's wristwatch with a shattered glass face. Strangely, the hands of the watch were frozen exactly at 11:17, the precise moment of the murder. But a broken watch wasn't the most shocking part of this discovery. When Marcus flipped the watch over, he saw an inscription beautifully engraved into the stainless steel back. It read, "To Julia. Forever." The moment Marcus read that name, a cold shiver ran straight down his spine. He froze completely. Because that wasn't just any name. He had heard that name before, 5 years ago. It belonged to the most infamous missing person case in the history of this county. Julia Platt. 5 years ago, she was a beautiful, bright young woman living in this very hill town. Until one stormy night, she walked out of her house and vanished into thin air. The case created an uproar back then, but the police never found a single lead. Julia's body was never recovered. And then, due to sudden, unexplained pressure from high-ranking officials, the investigation was abruptly shut down and buried forever. Julia Platt was a simple, quiet, and deeply loved music teacher at the local school. She was famous for her talent with the guitar and her gentle soul, making her a favorite among everyone in the town. But after her disappearance 5 years ago, the life and soul of this small town seemed to wither away. Everything changed. Whispers and dark rumors began to flood the streets. Some said she ran away with a wealthy lover, while others claimed she threw herself into the raging river. But the old-timers in town still whispered a darker truth behind closed doors. They whispered that Julia didn't run away. She was murdered because she saw something she was never supposed to see. Marcus immediately called his precinct and ordered the archives department to pull up the dusty, 5-year-old files of the Julia Platt case. As Marcus began flipping through the yellowed pages on the cafe table, he found a shocking piece of evidence that made his blood run cold. According to the last timeline in the file, the very last person seen with Julia the night she disappeared was none other than Ethan Orton, the man now lying dead on the floor. And there was something even more disturbing hidden deeper in that file. 5 years ago, just as the local detectives were about to crack the case, a wealthy and influential man used his political connections to forcefully shut the investigation down. That man was none other than the terrified businessman sitting right across from him, Richard Vance. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to lock into place. Marcus hurried into the manager's office to review the cafe's old security camera footage. But as he suspected, at exactly 11:17 p.m., the 5-second gap during the blackout was completely corrupted. The screen showed nothing but distorted black and white static lines. However, the footage right before the blackout revealed a very clear story. Ethan hadn't come to the cafe for a casual drink. He was desperately, frantically waiting for someone. Every 2 minutes, he would stare at the main entrance, check his phone, and tap his fingers violently against the table. The sheer terror of death was written all over his face. Right then, Marcus's tech team successfully recovered the deleted data from Ethan's phone. It revealed an incoming text message from an unknown burner number, sent at exactly 11:07 p.m., just 10 minutes before his death. The message was short, but it was chilling. Tonight, everything ends. Meet me at the Blue Pine Café. While Marcus was analyzing the text, Nora Kaplan quietly approached him from behind. She glanced around to make sure no one else was watching, and then slid an old, crumpled photograph from her purse into Marcus's hand. It was an old group photo. In the center stood Julia Platt, smiling brightly. And standing right beside her were 3 other men. One was Richard Vance. The second was Ethan Orton. But the third man, his face had been violently scratched out with a razor blade, making him completely unrecognizable. Marcus stared at the defaced photo and asked, "Where did you get this, Nora? And why are you really investigating this case?" Nora lowered her voice to a sharp whisper. "Because, Detective, I am not here on a vacation. I have been working undercover for the past 6 months, reinvestigating Julia Platt's disappearance. I knew her death was covered up by the biggest monsters in this town. The layers of this murder mystery were finally peeling away, exposing the ugly truth underneath. The dark history of 5 years ago was coming to light. Julia Platt wasn't just a music teacher. She had cleverly collected concrete, undeniable evidence against some of the most powerful people in the county. Evidence regarding illegal land-grabbing deals in these protected mountain forests. Evidence about major drug supply routes running through the hills. And evidence exposing the high-level politicians who protected the entire operation. And at the dead center of this criminal empire, the name that sat at the very top, was Richard Vance. Ethan Orton had been Richard's closest partner and his right-hand man back then. They were given the task to silence Julia forever. But just weeks after Julia disappeared, Ethan's conscience broke, or perhaps he just grew terrified. He abandoned Richard, fled the state, and changed his identity. Why? Because on that fateful night, Ethan had discovered a truth far worse than he had imagined. He found out the sheer brutality of what had actually happened to Julia. And tonight, 5 years later, Ethan's guilt had finally broken him. He could no longer live with the blood on his hands. Tonight, at the Blue Pine Café, Ethan was prepared to hand over all the hidden evidence to Nora and the federal authorities. He had texted Nora to meet him here. But Richard found out about Ethan's return and his plan to confess. Richard came tonight to stop him. To bury the secret forever. And that is why Ethan Orton had to die tonight. Despite all the confessions and evidence, Detective Marcus still found the silent old man to be the most unsettling piece of the puzzle. Throughout the entire chaotic night, he had spoken the least. Yet, his eyes looked as though they had absorbed every single raw emotion passing through the room. It was now close to 3 a.m. The rain outside was finally turning into a soft drizzle. Marcus walked over to the corner table where the old man sat, staring out into the misty night. Marcus sat down across from him, softening his tone. "Sir, it's time to tell me. Who are you really? What is your connection to this nightmare?" The old man smiled faintly, a smile filled with an unbearable, lifelong sorrow. "Me? I am not a killer, and I am barely a witness, detective. I am just a broken, old father." Marcus stopped breathing for a second. With trembling, wrinkled hands, the old man reached deep into the inner pocket of his faded overcoat. He pulled out a small, laminated photograph. It was a picture of Julia Platt as a young child, laughing and hugging her father. "Julia, she was my only child, detective." A lone tear escaped his bloodshot eyes, disappearing into his white beard. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the cafe once more. 5 years ago, on this exact same dark, stormy night, I was supposed to pick my daughter up right outside this very cafe. But I was running late. And by the time I got here, she was gone. The police laughed at me. They told me she ran away. His voice cracked with 5 years of suppressed rage and helplessness. Ever since that night, I sit in this cafe every stormy night, hoping for a clue. Hoping to find my little girl. And tonight, 5 years later, the man who destroyed my daughter's life crawled back here and died right in front of my eyes. To me, that is divine justice. At 4 a.m., the preliminary report from the forensic lab was rushed into Marcus's hands. As Marcus scanned the final medical conclusion, his eyes went wide. His breath caught in his throat. The report completely flipped the entire case upside down. According to the medical examiner, Ethan Orton did not die from the knife wound in his chest. The moment Marcus stated this out loud, the color drained from everyone's faces. Richard stammered, his voice cracking, What do you mean, detective?" The knife was literally sticking out of his chest. Marcus slammed the medical report onto the table. "The forensics are clear. Ethan Orton was already dead before the knife ever touched his skin. His cause of death was a massive, sudden cardiac arrest. The knife was driven into his body after he had already stopped breathing. Which meant, when the lights went out at 11:17 p.m., Ethan was already collapsing and dying from a heart attack on the floor. And under the cover of the absolute darkness, someone used the blackout to stage a brutal stabbing on a dead man's body. They created a theatrical murder scene. But why? To distract the police? To make it look like a personal vendetta? Now, a terrifying and complex question stared the detective in the face. If Ethan was already dying of a heart attack, who stabbed a dead body in the dark? And what was their real motive? Marcus closed his eyes, reconstructing the entire layout of the cafe in his mind. The flickering generator, the heavy rain on the glass windows, the exact positions of the witnesses, and suddenly, a sharp light bulb went off in his head. He understood everything. Not a single witness was lying. The most bizarre part of this case was that every single person was telling the absolute truth from their perspective. They truly did see different things that night, not because of a conspiracy, but because of physics and psychology. The torrential rain outside had created a thick, distorted film of water over the massive glass windows, transforming them into a series of imperfect mirrors. When the main lights began to flash and flicker right before the blackout, the low, erratic light created multiple overlapping reflections on the glass. And the moment the room went pitch black, panic took over. Their brains instantly filled the gaps with their deepest fears. Nora saw a man in a black coat running, because she had spent 6 months hunting a tall suspect matching that description. In reality, she had seen the distorted reflection of Richard panic shifting in his seat. Caleb, the waiter, saw long hair flying through the air, because as he fell backward in fear, he saw his own reflection in the polished glass of the counter. Caleb's own hair was long and unkempt. The old man truly believed Ethan had punished himself, because he had spent 5 years drowning in his own guilt, wishing for the perpetrators to destroy themselves. And young Aiden? He was absolutely correct. Right up until the blackout, no third person had ever approached that table. The killer was already sitting in front of Ethan. But the final, terrifying twist of this stormy night was still waiting to be uncovered. Marcus took one last look at Ethan's phone records and the threatening text message sent at 11:07 p.m. And suddenly, he spotted a tiny, fatal mistake made by the killer. That unknown text message, even though it landed on Ethan's phone, it wasn't meant for Ethan at all. Ethan had intercepted a message that was originally sent to Richard Vance's burner phone. Richard had found out that Ethan was returning to town to confess everything to Nora and the feds. So, the moment Ethan walked into the cafe, Richard used his trip to the restroom as a cover. He had already slipped a lethal, tasteless dose of a rare, slow-acting poison into Ethan's coffee cup before he arrived. A specialized poison designed to trigger a sudden, untraceable heart attack. The power outage wasn't an accident either. Richard had paid an accomplice to manually cut the main transformer lines outside at exactly 11:17, creating the perfect blackout. Richard's plan was simple. In the dark, he would stab Ethan's body, making the police think it was a random robbery or stabbing, ensuring the poison would never be investigated. He executed it perfectly. He stabbed a dead man in the dark to create total chaos. But in his meticulous master plan, Richard Vance made one fatal error. Julia's broken watch. Richard assumed Ethan carried that watch out of love and guilt. But why did Ethan really have it tonight? Because Ethan was carrying it to hand over to Detective Marcus as primary evidence. The watch had been recovered from the crime scene 5 years ago, and preserved on its steel back were Richard Vance's clear, unsmudged fingerprints. The moment Richard heard Marcus lay out the evidence, his knees buckled. He collapsed into his chair. The game was finally over. The first rays of the morning sun began to break through the mountain peaks. The heavy storm had finally ceased, leaving behind a crisp, quiet morning. The small hill town of River Pine was slowly waking up, returning to its peaceful routine, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. But the Blue Pine Café would never be the same. That stormy night was now permanently etched into its dark history. Richard Vance was let out in handcuffs, his empire ruined. But just before he was pushed into the back of the police cruiser, he turned around and looked directly into Detective Marcus's eyes. His voice trembled with a terrifying honesty. "Detective, I am going to prison because I poisoned Ethan tonight. I accept that. But I swear to God, 5 years ago, I did not kill Julia Platt. I am terrified of the man who did." Looking into Richard's eyes, Marcus felt a chill. The man was speaking the absolute truth. The nightmare was not over. The story was far from finished. Because Julia Platt's true, brutal killer, the mysterious fourth man whose face had been violently scratched out of the photograph, he was still out there. Walking free. Watching from the shadows. On dark, rainy nights. We often see exactly what we are most afraid of. Sometimes, the witnesses don't lie, it is their fears and their memories that speak for them. And memories don't always tell the full truth. If you enjoyed this dark, psychological murder mystery from River Pine, the next time a storm hits your town, turn off your lights, Put on your headphones and join us for our next tale. Subscribe Blackwood Files, because some dark truths can only be heard in the howling of the storm. Until next time, stay safe.